Gerry, most of you know Gerry. He spoke with us before. He was the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal for many years. He got a Pulitzer Award under the Wall Street Journal, got it under his leadership, and now he's still with the Wall Street Journal as a columnist. He's written the book about the crisis of democracy, crisis of confidence of the people in the institutions, and he has a TV show where he is the host. So we are very glad to have you. I can read a little bit more so that we aggrandize a little bit more Gerry's standing. His journalistic journey began with noteworthy role at the Financial Times, the Times of London, and the BBC, which showed his dedication to storytelling and broadcasting. Before delving into journalism, Mr. Baker embarked on a path of financial analysis starting at the Bank of England. Many journalists, no references here, started in banking, but I also changed from banking into journalism. He was educated at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, where he graduated in '83 with a first in philosophy, politics, and economics. His book again is American Breakdown: Why We No Longer Trust Our Leaders and Institutions and How We Can Rebuild Confidence, which was published just this past month of September. So by talking to him and going out of here, we hope that we will have all the answers, that we will solve all the problems. Gerry, why don't you come? Please give him a round of applause.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you very much indeed, Mario. Thank you for inviting me. Mario, in his very generous, very kind, overly generous introduction, didn't say, but he knows this very well, and I know many of you here, that I do honestly have a genuine claim to be the world's greatest Italophile. So it's always a pleasure for me to be among Italians. I spend a lot of time in Italy, and I just love Italian conversation, and to have the opportunity to talk with a group of Italian Americans is such a wonderful opportunity.
So Argentina also somehow surprised us. Nobody thought that this man, Javier Milei, would win the election. He seemed overly weird, much further ahead of Trump in many ways, and worryingly so. But one thing that he said he's not going to go is he says, I don't care about the Falkland Islands. England can have them. So what about this election? And what about, is this yet another sign of how democracies are becoming more and more confused?
Look, I think it's been characterized, and I think largely rightly, his election victory is another example of the wave of populist success. Populism, it's a very, it's a very inexact term, but I think it broadly does capture what's been going on. I think you could argue this populist wave, frankly, began, I know we British always like to claim to be the authors of everything, but it did really begin with the Brexit referendum in the June of 2016.
I'm sorry, I think the populist movement began with the Northern League.
Oh, okay, all right, sorry, yeah, well, fine.
We don't want to go that far back.
So. Okay, well, you can go way, way back. But I mean, this round, what we've seen, you could be Brexit, Trump, the rise of these populist parties in Europe. I mean, obviously, you've had people like Viktor Orban, obviously in Hungary. You've now got a populist government led by a populist leader in Italy. The parties of what are generally termed the far right in Europe, like the AfD in Germany, the National Rally in France under Marine Le Pen, making huge strides. I mean, even though Le Pen didn't win that election, she got 44% of the vote, which was extraordinary for a party that was 20 years ago regarded as beyond the pale. So you're seeing this, and Argentina, I think, can be seen in that context too. It is complicated because he's a libertarian, and he differs on, and he wants to dollarize his economy for a start. Well, that's which is very, very good. One of the hallmarks of this populism is nationalism, right? This is what I think has given. This is probably almost certainly the defining characteristic of this populism. It was a nationalist sentiment that led the British people to vote for Brexit. I think it's a lot of nationalist sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment that's behind Trump. Certainly, you're seeing these parties that we just had it in the Netherlands. So you've got these nationalist movements where national identity, securing the border, restoring power to national governments away from the EU or from international institutions, and yet you have this guy who's described as a populist in Argentina who wants to literally do away with his own currency and essentially, surrender all monetary authority to the Federal Reserve. So it's complicated, but I think generally speaking, this movement, and I write about this in my book, that's been going on now for at least 10 years, is a reaction to what I think is seen by many people as this global elite who have done extraordinarily well for themselves, and indeed in many respects for their economies, the kind of Davos crowd, if you like, who have knocked down borders, economic borders, trade, capital markets, in many ways knocked down human borders with widespread migration, and elevated the nation, they elevated the globe, if you like, the world, above the interest of the nation state. And people have said, we don't want that. We are turning against that. And that's why you're getting this, again, I think this is the defining characteristic of it, this sort of nationalist rebellion going on around the world. And I don't think we've seen the half of it yet. I think it's going to continue.
Okay, before we move into a little bit more in more detail into that, let's move into the international situation. So we have a full spectrum of what's going on and how these American elections will fit in. So we had worrying news from the Ukraine today, from the situation over there. All of a sudden, the Ukraine is back in the news after Hamas attacked Israel. So we have two wars, and the whole objective has been to contain the wars within a very tight local, not even regional, but local environment. And so far, it seems that also with Hamas, Israel that has happened. So what is your assessment of those two conflicts, and what is the risk that the spark, just a spark maybe, could make it all of a sudden a bigger war?
Yeah, I mean, starting with Ukraine, I mean, I think it is pretty obvious that, what we have in Ukraine at best is a stalemate. And the optimism that began pretty well straight after the invasion, when Russia failed to secure its objectives and failed to occupy Ukraine as it expected to, and frankly as everybody else expected it to within a few weeks. When that didn't happen, optimism steadily grew. Ukraine, and people saw Ukraine fighting very bravely and resisting the invader. And at the end of last year, it's actually started to push Russians back from positions that they had. And I think there was I remember interviewing people like General David Petraeus telling me literally a year ago, I think it was last December, look, Ukraine can win this war. They can actually expel Russia from all of that, certainly all of the Ukraine, perhaps with the exception of Crimea, and they can actually inflict a massive military defeat on Russia. There was the joke going around was that what the Russian invasion of Ukraine had given us a completely new understanding of Russia's lack of military power. The joke was, we used to think that Russia had the second most powerful military in the world. Now we know that it only has the second most powerful military in Ukraine. But I'm afraid to say that optimism has dissipated. I don't detect anybody now in the United States who really thinks that this war can be, and again, we have to define our terms, but can be won in the sense of Ukraine being able to take back much more of the territory that it's already taken back. Russia simply has enormous resources. It also has, which we don't, the strategic patience to wait this out. We've seen this throughout Russian history. They take defeats, they have extraordinary levels of manpower and resources, and they're willing to throw those resources at it. We, frankly, in the West aren't. I'm speaking to people this week in Washington about support for Ukraine. It's wilting dramatically. Republicans are now largely against any more additional financial and military support for Ukraine. We're going to see what happens to this bill, which is before Congress, but it's quite likely it will end up not providing additional funds. Europeans, as you know, while they're still supportive of Ukraine, they're kind of losing confidence there too. So I really do feel, I think that, I suspect there's going to have to be some kind of a settlement, which will probably leave Russia in control of the land that it has right now. And more importantly, and this is my real concern, it will represent, another hammer blow to the reputation of the United States, I think, and NATO. We saw in Afghanistan in 2021, Look, and I think there were good reasons for pulling out of Afghanistan, but that was a humiliation. After 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the United States ended up handing the country back to the people that it had actually expelled in that invasion. That was a disaster and a humiliation for the US. Iraq ended in large-scale humiliation for the US. Other attempts in the Middle East, Syria, Libya, none of those ended well for the US. Now we have this major ground war in Europe in which the US has poured huge resources, not in terms of material, not in terms of human resources, but in terms of financial and military resources, and it looks like that's going to be another defeat. So I think the prestige of the United States is going to take a huge blow when the Ukraine war is over. Very briefly on Hamas and Israel.
Yeah.
Look,
Will it stay local, or you think there is still
I
a
think
risk?
it will stay local. I was initially concerned, and again, I'm talking to people, I'm a reporter as much as anything, so talking to people in the region and in the US, I think there was a genuine concern that it would spread quickly, that Hezbollah might attack in the north. Iran, which is clearly behind this, either directly or indirectly, is clearly behind both Hamas and Hezbollah, might take the opportunity, it has taken the opportunity, there have been lots of attacks on, especially on US personnel and US forces in the region. But I think the feeling now, I talked to someone in Israel just the other day, that now that hostilities have resumed again, there is an expectation, I think, that they won't go on for very long. I mean, I think there's a sense, which isn't widely reported in the US or in Europe, but there is a sense that Israel has achieved most of its major objectives. It has taken out a significant number of the Hamas leadership. It's going, it's essentially expelled Hamas from the northern part of Gaza, which is very important for Israel's defense. So I think that is going to wind down without further escalation, but it's still obviously very volatile.
Anyway, so this is the general. We can go in further details here, but I think that's probably give us pretty much the picture, and you said it, the US is perceived as being in decline in its influence and its power. And so we are starting the process in a couple of months of the primaries that will lead to the elections. And the common thought is that these elections in the end will be again a competition between Biden and Trump. Not everybody thinks like that. A person that you and I know, but who will remain unnamed, said the other evening that he thinks that neither Trump nor Biden will run, and that there will be someone else, either Nikki Haley on the Republican side, or Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan, on the Democratic side, or Gavin Newsom, but that something will change, either because of health issue or because of courts, but that we haven't seen. We are so far away from it that something can change. And then last night I saw someone else who's equally into it and says, "Oh, I'm willing to bet this guy $100,000 that it will be Trump Biden." So we need your wisdom. Will it be Trump Biden, or will it be someone else?
I'm certainly not willing to bet $100,000 on Trump. If you were asking if that's where this was going, Mario, I'm sorry.
We can gather some money here.
Put that kind of stake on. Look, I think the likelihood. What can one say? One just looks forward and estimates probabilities, but I think the high probability is it will be Trump Biden. It was very interesting. What you heard what Biden said yesterday. Quite interesting that he's kind of running mainly because Trump's running, which is kind of revealing, I think, in itself. But I do think there is a path to neither of them being the nominee. I don't think any time in the near future they'll voluntarily withdraw. Trump will not voluntarily withdraw at all. There's circumstances which I'll come to in which Biden may. I think the path is this. I think Trump right now leads. We look at all the national polls for the Republicans, and he leads by 50 points. Right? No one's ever had that kind of a lead in the last 20 years of polling at this stage of the primary election. But as everybody says, and it's right, you do have to ignore the national polls. The national polls are kind of meaningless because they change dramatically during the course of a campaign. We have to look at a campaign as a dynamic activity, not a static activity. Because once you have the first result out of Iowa, as happened in 2004, 2008, 2012, it changes. The race changes. The race becomes much less predictable once people start to vote. So it's the states that matter. The first state, obviously, that votes is Iowa on January 15th. And there's the polling there, Trump still leads, big lead, 30 points, but not 50 points. But there's, I think, a real possibility. Again, it's not no larger than, a man's hand or whatever you want to say, but there is a real possibility that the anti-Trump vote in the Republican Party could coalesce around probably Nikki Haley. I think it probably is Nikki Haley. That she could get a bit of a boost out of Iowa, even without winning. So say, she's currently running about 15% in the polls. DeSantis is about the same, 15-16%, and Trump is up there at about 45. But say she does very well, comes a very strong second. Say Trump only gets 40, she gets in the 30s. That will immediately then change the conversation. It will change the dynamic of the race. There'll be a lot of pressure on the others to drop out, which they probably will, if they haven't already. Then we go to New Hampshire a week, just over a week later. And there, again, Trump has a big lead, but much smaller than his national lead. And there, Haley is clearly in second place. There's a strong possibility, I wouldn't say strong, but there is a possibility that she comes out of Iowa strengthened. She then goes to New Hampshire, and she then beats him in New Hampshire. That's possible. It's happened before, with famously with John McCain, George W. Bush in 2000. It's happened many, many times. And she then beats him. And then the next race, Nevada as well, but the next most important race is South Carolina in February. And that's her home state. At this stage, it'll be a two-person race, Trump versus her. We don't know at this point how Trump will be reacting. Well, we can probably guess. He'll be claiming the election was rigged, that the voters of New Hampshire were cheated, and all of this stuff. So we don't. That itself may have an effect. And then, as I say, she runs to South Carolina. It's her home state. She could well end up winning South Carolina. So again, I'm not saying this is going to happen. I would
she
give
was
it
governor of South Carolina.
She was governor of South Carolina, exactly. I would give her, maybe give this a 20-30% probability, but it's not negligible. And so, if we get to the end if she wins South Carolina and she's won New Hampshire and done well in Iowa, the whole complexion of the race can be changed. So and then, by the way, if that happens,
yeah, exactly.
If Trump then loses, I think there will be tremendous pressure. Because if you look at the polling right now, Trump beats Biden by about 2 or 3 points in the polling. Haley beats Biden by 10 points. Democrats are terrified right now. They think that Biden is too old and weak and he's going to lose to Trump. They will be even more scared if Trump isn't the nominee. They want Trump to be the nominee because they know he's the candidate against whom they have the best chance. Okay. If Haley's the nominee, I think there will then be enormous pressure on Biden to drop out. There won't be a primary, but I think there's a good chance Biden would then drop out at the convention. We'd have a kind of brokered convention in next July, I think it is, or August. And a candidate, as you say, like a Gretchen Whitmer could come through. So that I think is, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but that is the plausible scenario by which neither Trump nor Biden is the nominee.
But you're still not willing to put $10,000 against $100,000. So let's talk about the Republican Party a bit, because Trump has the control of the party also in Congress, and we've seen the disaster that we had at the House with McCarthy being expelled and so on and so forth, and the hard time they had in finding a new leader. The whole establishment, it seems to me, of the Republican Party, especially the business community, is completely against Trump, not just in favor of someone else, but they don't want Trump to succeed. They fear that it could be a disaster for the country. So let's project that scenario for a second. What will happen to America if Trump will win the elections?
Well, as an Italian, if you remember what happened in Italy in the 1920s. I mean, that's obviously, but that is the scenario that's been talked about a lot. In the last week, there's been this flurry of articles about the dictatorship, about Trump as Mussolini or Hitler or whatever. Don't get me wrong. I think Trump. I think it would be. I think it would be a very bad thing if Trump were to be the nominee of the Republican Party. I think it would establish the Republican Party essentially as an extra constitutional party, because what he did after the election. Look, as you know, Mary, you and I have had our disagreements. I'm not a fan of Trump, but at the same time, I never went along with the hysteria about Trump in 2016 that he was a Russian agent, that he was a fascist and crazy and all this stuff. I never did, and I thought actually his presidency was a kind of weird sort of circus or performance, while actually some reasonably good things were done, particularly in the Middle East, particularly with China, arguably some of the domestic policies too. But there was this kind of weird sort of grand guignol being performed, which didn't really amount to anything. I think his behaviour after the election changed that, certainly changed it for me, and changed it for a lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans, including the business people you've talked about. He tried to overturn the election result, extra constitutionally, and I think he should have been impeached and should have been removed from office. He shouldn't be the candidate right now. So I think let me stipulate all of that. That said, I'm a little sceptical of the America's about to fall into dictatorship argument, which was, as I say, articulated in the last couple of weeks by a number of people. I'll give you a number of reasons why. Firstly, the US still does have the rule of law. It still has a very, very well established and independent judiciary. Now, and we saw, by the way, in the aftermath of the 2020 election, how that works, which is Trump tried to take his case that the election was stolen to the courts, and every single court rejected it, including a significant number of judges that he himself had appointed. So we still have an independent judiciary. I'm not naive about it. Of course, there are things he can do. The power of the presidential pardon. He can, appoint more judges who are friendly to him. But it's going to be quite hard for him. I think one of the things people worry about is him going after his political enemies through the weaponization of justice. Well, I think he may well want to do that. And it's one of the main reasons Trump shouldn't be president. Will he be able to do it? I'm skeptical, because he's going to have to convince, he maybe will be able to convince his prosecutors or order his prosecutors in the Justice Department to prosecute Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or anybody else for that matter. But they're going to still have to take it to a court of law, and they're going to have to win that in a court of law, and I think that's unlikely. So I think that's, I think it's overdone. Again, I'm not in any way dismissing it, but I think it's overdone. And the other thing, which I think is true about Trump, I've spent a lot of time with him over the years, he just doesn't, he has no attention span. To be a dictator, you've really got to take it seriously. You've got to take government seriously. You've actually got to you've got to have an agenda which you want to implement, and you've got to be committed to it. You can't be a part-time dictator. You can't be, a kind of, a dilettante dictator. You have to really, really go for it and really, really want it. Trump doesn't have the attention span. He just doesn't. I mean, he has no interest other than himself. He's a complete narcissist. And the idea that he would actually have the energy or the understanding or the knowledge to put together a kind of a political dictatorship, I think is implausible. Again, that's not to say he should be elected. I'm against it. I just think some of this stuff is a little
So America will not be a dictatorship, but presumably it will not help its standing in the world. I mean, people will be generally upset. It will send the wrong signal.
Well, not in places like Russia and China.
No, of course, but not in those countries, but in Europe and in other democracies. So the risk will. So it will be a generally confusing situation, which brings us back to your book, of course. But let's talk for a second about the other candidates. I mean, Ron DeSantis seems to be out at this point, no? Like Pence, Vice President, and so on and so forth. So,
let me finish just very quickly before you do that. Because you want to pick up on what you said about how the world views Trump. I broadly agree. Certainly, parts of the world that you and I spend most of our time in outside the United States, Mario, will have that view. But I also think, and again, I'm not defending Trump. Please don't get me wrong. If anything, I'm maybe doing a little devil's advocacy here. I do think dangerous people in the world fear Trump much more than they fear Joe Biden. I think the United States, back to our conversation about Afghanistan, Ukraine, Syria, Libya. I think the United States is not feared in the world right now. I think it is regarded as weak. I think it's lost its prestige. I think they see all these attacks on American ships, on American bases in the Middle East, and Biden does nothing. And Biden, and the thing about Trump, people, I've had conversations with foreign leaders who say, he's kind of crazy, but he's kind of, that scares the hell out of people. It's like, you've probably just seen the movie Napoleon. They didn't include my favourite line from the Duke of Wellington. The Duke of Wellington, apparently at the Battle of Waterloo, said about his own British troops as he looked at them, he said, I don't know what effect they have on the enemy, but they scare the life out of me. And that is Trump, right? Trump scares people. He scares Americans, but he scares people in the rest of the world too. The taking out Soleimani, which he did in his presidency, absolutely nobody expected that to happen. And there is an unpredictability about him, which is terrifying on one level, but on another level, also does make people a little bit more nervous about dealing with the United States. So that's all I'll say on that.
But okay, so I happen to disagree on a couple of points you mentioned, but that's all right. But so don't you think that the contrary, meaning all of a sudden the US has two women in their 50s running against each other, and that is what America has done very often, has brought itself much forward, you know, with a jump of a generation, would send a stronger message about the capacity of this country to change, if that was the case, or not?
You're seriously raising the prospect of President Kamala Harris?
No. I'm saying
that doesn't.
Not Kamala. I'm saying
Oh.
Nikki Haley, and if the race was Nikki Haley and
Gretchen Whitmer.
Yeah, Gretchen Whitmer. Sorry, I might have.
No. I understand. I think Harris is much more likely to be the nominee than Gretchen Whitmer. But anyway, that's where I thought you were going. So.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
I'm saying in cases that either her or Newsom, so that a new generation, all of a sudden, America is presenting a new. What kind of message would that send to the world?
Look, I mean, I don't. I don't think if you're looking at it from Beijing or Moscow, which are the places that really matter right now, or for that matter, Damascus or Riyadh, I don't think, to be honest with you, they have this sort of sensibility about, oh, isn't it great that America's, you know, all modern now because it's got women running for office. I'm sorry to be sort of cynical about it, but I don't think. It will certainly change the view of sort of, you know, the kind of the in the salons of Europe, Mario, where you and I no doubt spend a lot of time. It will be treated in Davos as a moment of epiphany and, you know, wonderful revolution that the United States has finally caught up with the rest of the world. But I don't think in capitals where they're looking at how they deal with the United States on an economic and a geopolitical basis, they'll be looking at the people, the candidates, rather than some kind of airy-fairy idea that isn't it great.
And one thing, by the way, I'm opening up the floor to questions, so get ready in a minute or so. But I wanted to say that what people overlook is they keep focusing on the political strength, but they overlook the fact that there are 4 or 5 companies in the United States that capitalize as much as Italy or other countries. So there has been a bit of a shift in power. So to discount America, to think that America is weaker because there is a weaker leader, doesn't necessarily equate to the fact that America is still an amazing, extraordinary power.
Oh, I agree. I mean, it is one of the paradoxes of America today.
Because
is
we
America's-
haven't, yeah, exactly.
No, go on, sorry.
No, because you were addressing about the projection of the leadership and so on, which is true. But what about the perception of America as a capitalist country? Because that is another thing that is being discussed and debated.
I think that's a very good point. And again, it is a paradox of the current situation in the United States, whereas it is politically seen as politically weak, and I just think it's hard to argue, given what you've seen with Afghanistan, given what you've seen, sadly, what may be about to happen in Ukraine, what's gone more broadly in the Middle East. And by the way, this isn't just all Biden. I'm not all attacking. This is 20 years of American decline and American failure, from Iraq, and which was the worst foreign policy mistake in my view, and that was a Republican president in American history, possibly the worst foreign policy mistake ever. So I agree with you. The political situation, I would argue the geopolitical heft of the United States has weakened significantly. But you're absolutely right. The economy, I mean, if you by any measure, the economy's bounced back much more quickly than other economies from COVID. The US today, I was just looking at these numbers, the US today accounts for still about 23% of global GDP. I think in 1979 it accounted for about 28% of global GDP. In 79, Europe accounted for about 25% of GDP, just a little bit less in the United States. It's down to about 16% now. So, so there's no question that, Mohammed El-Arian, the great economist, likes to refer to the United States as the cleanest dirty shirt. So it's a pretty, US growth hasn't been good by historic standards for the last 10 years, but it's been a lot better than most of them, certainly in Europe and indeed in Korea. And by the way, the other thing I quickly would say, sorry, I'm waffling up too long here, but 5 years ago, Murray, again, as you and I know, we spent, many people here, Federico has written a lot about China. It was almost axiomatic among sort of the smart American, political, intellectual leadership that China would overtake the United States. That this was the 21st century was China's century, that economically it would outstrip the United States steadily, by some measures it already has, but it was going to hugely outweigh the United States You find very few people now who are confident of that. So that absolutely has changed. And I agree with you in terms of American companies, the largest companies in the world, the most successful companies. So there is that paradox. I agree that America's economic weight remains as strong as ever, but it just doesn't have the political heft that it used to.
Thank you. So to summarize, we have, you don't fear that Trump will become a dictator. We think that there may be a change if something goes, if something happens in Iowa or New Hampshire. We agree that on the Democratic field and the Republican field, those are the names. So we know the international situation, so let's open to the floor. Yes?
You mentioned the Falkland or Malvinas before. I'm thinking about Mrs. Thatcher. Don't you think that maybe Nikki Haley could be seen as the Iron Lady, and thus Putin and his friends in Tehran or China could actually be more scared?
You don't have to, you don't have to be a male to be a very, very tough leader. And I partly agree. I'm not 100% convinced about Nikki Haley. I don't think she's any Margaret Thatcher, bluntly. I think she is, shall we say, overly flexible in her principles, in my view. I mean, this is someone who, was identified with the conservative and the neoconservative wing of the Republican Party. She very happily signed on to work for Donald Trump as his ambassador to the United Nations, worked with him, obviously publicly supported him, said she was going to support him again, did support him again in 2020. And now she's, now she's no longer for him, and now she seems to be back favouring policies, associated with the Bush administration rather than with the Trump administration she was a member of. So she's, Margaret Thatcher, whatever her strengths and weaknesses, was pretty consistent in most of these things, and I don't really see that in Nikki Haley.
Thank you. Massimo.
Do you think that will be the impact of the trials on Trump, not only on the mood of the electorate, but also on the institution of some states that could try maybe to not accept the vote for a convicted felon?
No, I think that's right, Mario. I mean, we don't know. We can be pretty confident that for Trump supporters, the trial, whatever happens in the trial, and arguably particularly if he's convicted in these trials, if any of them comes to trial and certainly comes to a completion before the election, we can be pretty confident that that will only increase his support among hardcore Republicans, because they do regard the whole thing as the weaponization of justice. They regard it as a witch hunt. They regard it as completely unjustified, and as Mario says, the manipulation of the court process. So we can be pretty confident it will have that effect, because we've seen it already in the course of the last year. What effect? That's the interesting question. Is we just don't know what effect, when people are exposed to this day after day. If and when these trials do start. When people are exposed day after day to the evidence, and it won't be televised actually, but there'll be obviously extensive reporting. I don't know. It could have an effect. I suspect it will have a negative effect on swing voters. In terms of the states, I think it's going to be hard for them to keep them off the ballot. So, I mean, first of all, there's no law against a convicted felon running for president. There's no the only disqualifications, as you know, in the Constitution for the president is being under the age of 35 and not being a native-born American citizen. So he could run his campaign from prison if he wants. There is an attempt, as you know, in a couple of states to get him off the ballot on the grounds that because of January the 6th, he conducted an insurrection against the government of the United States, which I think, if I'm lawyers in the room, I think it's the 14th Amendment. After the Civil War, they're claiming that he's already been found essentially to have led an insurrection, and therefore is barred from holding public office under the 14th Amendment. I suspect that won't work either. So I think the political impact is unknown. I think the sort of legal impact it's very likely to keep him off the ballot.
Thank you. We have lawyers in the room, by the way, and some that I think cover with great detail this issue. Maybe Philip, you want to ask something about that. But and one question is, shall we have a trial? I mean, is it feasible that it will happen before the primaries or during the primaries? Can he be convicted and then he has to stop? I mean, what are the technicalities or the technical impact on this?
I'd be delighted to hear from the lawyer. I mean, the lawyers I speak to say
we will ask,
yes, probably, but obviously the main trials are supposed to start in March. Obviously, there could be postponements. I think, there's a serious public opinion. I seriously would like to hear from the lawyer, but that the whole thing could be put off until after the election. All of these could be put off until after the election.
Philip.
Yeah, it will be over nothing will happen finally before the election.
So there will be no result out.
If there's a result, it will be disputed and it will go on. So it won't be determinative except to the extent it affects public opinion, and that it can affect public opinion positively toward Trump.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
but they might be convicted.
Stephen,
Yes, I think you said the Democratic Party preferred Trump be nominated. Well, if this is the case, do you think in the United States, American democracy is at risk more with a Trump be winning actually the White House, or if he's defeated?
I do think the election of Trump would represent a significant blow, though, to American democracy. I do think that. And I think his defeat, preferably in the Republican primary, would restore a sense of kind of constitutionalism to the Republican Party, which I think, again, quite frankly, the Republican Party is in danger of losing right now. So, yeah, I think a victory for Trump, again, while I do not think it's, Weimar Republic or 1920s Italy, I think it will be problematic for American democracy to elect someone who directly tries to overthrow and subvert the constitutional process in the way that he did last time around. I think that will be a problem.
Just a quick
Thank you.
follow-up, because maybe...
oh, sorry, Stefano, because we have some other questions, so, and we're closing
just
to the
because
end.
maybe my question wasn't clear enough. What I mean is, because Trump will not accept the election if he's defeated, the response. So do you think that today, how the country is, the mood of the country, that would be very dangerous when he will not accept it?
No, I mean, it will depend on the result. Again, if we have a very close election, yeah, it could be difficult. I don't think there will be a mood, though. It was different when he was the incumbent, and the circumstances of 2020 were very unusual because of the COVID, the special emergency provisions for voting under because of the COVID, because of the pandemic. So I don't think the mood. I don't think there'll be a kind of Trump. There'll be a strong pro-Trump movement if he did lose the election next time. I will say this though. I think I do. One thing I really worry about, and I think this is back to my point in my book about trust and the loss of trust. Both sides are losing trust in the institutions of government. Both Democrats and Republicans, and I worry that the result of this election, if Trump wins the election, I think there will be, a very serious rebellion in the United States. I don't necessarily mean an armed rebellion. There will be, people have talked about some states going for nullification. I think, I was in New York, as many of you probably were, on the, in the week leading up to the 2020 election, and every shopfront on Madison Avenue was boarded up. That was not in the expectation of a Joe Biden victory. That was in the expectation of a Donald Trump victory, when people expected, probably rightly, that there would be a repeat of the riots we saw in cities over the summer, done largely by and at the behest of the left wing in this country. So if Trump were to win, especially in a close election, a closely contested election, especially if he has been convicted already at that point of a felony, I would expect to see really widespread protest, opposition to Trump. As I say, possibly going as far as some states actually trying to nullify the election.
Okay, quickly, we have 3 last questions.
How do you feel about the possibility of a third party threat affecting the dynamics of the other parties in the election?
My question is about the Democratic Party. Do you see relevant, significant consequence of the October 7 Hamas attack on the Democratic Party here, because of the division, the growing gap between the Jewish community and the pro-Palestinian or even pro-Hamas left wing of the party?
Third party, first of all, I think there is a very, if it's Trump v. Biden, which I still think is the likeliest outcome, which we will know presumably in the spring. Super Tuesday is early March. We'll know it probably as soon as late March, unless something happens to Biden after that. But if we know it's Trump v. Biden by March, April, I think there is a very real chance that there will be a third party candidate. Look, I remember I was here partly in 1992 when Ross Perot ran again in 1996. Ross Perot in 1992 got 19% of the vote, and that was after he had sort of had that kind of weird kind of derangement publicly, where he, accused the Bush family of disrupting his daughter's wedding or whatever it was, and he was ridiculed, and he still got 19% of the vote. So the idea that a third-party candidate could come through, and in those circumstances, I'm talking about this with Federico over lunch. Remember, in 1992, you had two largely mainstream candidates for the Democratic and Republican Party. They argued it out, of course, but George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton were pretty solidly mainstream political figures. And still, in those circumstances, by focusing on just one issue, which was the deficit, which is what Ross Perot did, he managed to come through the middle and get nearly 20% of the vote, and he would have got more if he hadn't had that sort of weird breakdown. So there is definitely the possibility there, and I think particularly this time around, you've got two candidates who, one candidate who is very obviously outside the mainstream of politics, Donald Trump. The other candidate, I would argue, Joe Biden, is viewed by many, many people, whether you like him or not, or his policies or not, as unfit to be president. So you have two people who large numbers of people in this country regard as unfit to be president, and a kind of a mainstream figure, not a kind of a Ross Perot sort of slightly eccentric figure, but a potentially mainstream figure like a Joe Manchin, who I think is seriously contemplating a run. So I think there is a good chance. Now, whether, interestingly, I've looked at the arithmetic of this, because of the electoral system in the US, if it's a genuinely three-way split, a third-party candidate only needs to get about 35% of the vote to actually win the election, or at least to win enough electoral college votes to throw the election into the House of Representatives, where of course then presumably Trump would win. But I think, so I think the short answer to the question, I think there is a very real possibility that there will be a strong third-party candidate. And Federico, to your point, I think I think October 7th has been a very important sort of seminal moment in democratic politics. I think it has emphasized just sort of how far out of the mainstream many young Democrat-leaning, they're not even necessarily Democrats, but young sort of left-wing so-called progressive people are. We've lived in this country, many of us, for a very, very long time, and I don't think we've ever seen anything like what we've seen in the last couple of months in terms of the pro-Palestinian, or as you say, even pro-Hamas demonstrations on the street. The United States is always the reliable ally of Israel. The Democratic Party, under both presidents, but particularly under the Democratic Party, with a strong Jewish base, very, very reliably pro-Israel. I think that's very much in doubt now, and you're seeing that. Look, to be fair, I'll give Biden credit, he has been very robust in supporting Israel so far, both rhetorically, but also sending US warships to the Mediterranean and doing everything else. And he's been very good, I think, in terms of those of us who support Israel on that. But I do think there's strong undercurrents that are pushing back hard. We see it, whether it's some of those members of Congress, and astonishingly, there was that vote in the House the other day, which was a simple resolution to condemn anti-Semitism, and 80 Democrats didn't vote for it. So I think that is becoming an issue. So I think on both, I think a lot of Jewish voters who've been reliably Democratic are going to be looking at this and thinking, especially in potentially swing states. There are a lot of Jewish voters in Michigan, Florida's probably a Republican state now anyway, but I think that could be quite significant from the Jewish voting side, and from the young pro-Palestinian, decolonizers, whatever you want to call them, all that sort of left-wing, radical crowd. I think a lot of them could defect from Biden. Cornel West, who's running, also yet another of these candidates who's running, seems to be picking up some support from those. Jill Stein could pick up some support as the Green candidate. Kennedy might get some support. So yeah, I think it is. I think it could have important immediate electoral implications, and I think it could have quite significant longer-term political implications in the United States in terms of a kind of a realignment of the parties around the whole issue of Israel and Israel-Palestine in particular.
Thank you.
Just elaborate on the possible implication of the Biden approach to Israel in the swing voters. We have a couple of polls, one from the New York Times that says that moderates are just much more for the Israel than the Palestinian, versus a Gallup poll that says that it's actually split. Is it going to be an issue, and if yes, what kind of weight will this have on the swing and the moderate voters?
I think, as I said, I don't think it will be that much of an issue, except in the circumstances that I described, where I think Biden could lose younger, some, not many, we're not talking tens of millions, maybe a few million perhaps, which could be crucial in a close election. He could lose some younger voters, I think, to those more extreme candidates. So I think there is a political risk for him there. In terms of but overall, I think the saliency of Israel-Palestine is not going to be very high. I mean, if you ask voters what's on their mind right now, and you give them a list of 10 things, it doesn't even come up. Israel-Palestine doesn't come up. It's inflation, the economy, immigration, crime, education, all the usual stuff you'd expect. So with the one caveat that should it blow up further in a way that we discussed and hope it won't, if it blew up further into a much wider conflagration and the United States were dragged into it, then of course it becomes enormously important. But right now, I don't see it as being, except in the marginal ways that I've described, I don't see it being a significant electoral factor next year.
Thank you. Conversation will continue in the next year, a key year. Happy holidays, everybody. We continue with Jay in January. Enjoy the cookies. We can still hang around, but our 2023 Jay event is over. Thank you all for coming and happy holidays.